going to start this last seminar for this mini course. I promised you yesterday that we'll have time to go over some of your research ideas to get you started. For those who want to use their own research ideas as examples for us to do a collective or some collective exercises. But before that, I'd like to use my third book-length project, the one that you heard on Global China, as an example to illustrate the third way of doing comparison, and also a kind of ethnography that is quite fashionable these days and necessary because of the phenomenon of globalization. It is with us, and whatever you study, whether you study family, labor, social movement, investment, migration, of course, these are all global phenomena now. And for ethnographers, the question is, how do you use ethnography as a method to study global phenomena? The one that I studied in this book, in the Specter of Global China, was just one example of among many that you can name as part of this vague term, part of this idea of globalization. But even as I think Professor Lan Peijia, she has a new book herself, and it's about global family, raising global family. So even in intimate areas of society, family, child rearing, you can find traces of globalization. And so it's difficult to even pinpoint an area of social life that is immune or is isolated from this thing called globalization. So that means ethnography can be applied because ethnography has been used to study different arenas of life. I mean, you go to a church, I'm sure, or well, I can only say I bet that church is part of a global network of churches. It's part of this religion. Has always been one of the earliest cases of globalization, right? Religion has always been global. Whether you talk about Buddhism, Catholicism, Christianity, Muslim, Islam, Judaism, these are all global phenomena. So I encourage you to think about, this is the time when we need to tackle the global level, whatever you study, and to maybe explore the way ethnographers can leverage the method to study something that is quite global. It's almost contradictory in term when you think about it, because ethnography used to be, for most people, still is considered a method for you to study something really local and time-specific and micro. And now you say, hey, global ethnography can be used to study the global, which is like, this is what it cannot do in most people's mind. So I'm going to talk about what it means to do global ethnography. But I think for you may not be interested in China, in Africa, or China, or global China, but I think it's worth thinking. Whatever you study, try to think whether what you're studying actually is a global phenomenon. And if your field site happens to be in Taiwan or China, it's just a particular instance of something larger, something more transnational. And if so, don't you need to then contextualize your case, ask questions about your case in light of this more global trend, global pattern about your phenomenon, in order to actually be able to appreciate, specify what is particular or peculiar about Taiwan or Hong Kong or whatever that your field site happens to be. Because you'll be asked, you can't assume these days that I study a case in Taiwan and you think people won't ask you about what is so special about Taiwan, because global is so prominent as a fact of life in our mind that people would, you go into a conference, you most likely you will be asked that kind of question. And I think the question is also very interesting. It forces us, it compels us to do more rigorous social science, involving more work, but it will make social science much more interesting, because you can't be content or you can't be complacent with one case, and as if nobody will challenge you, hey, what's the value of this particular case if you have, around the world so many different cases? What is unique about Taiwan or about China? It used to be, I've been talking about this many times in the past year to people in China studies in the United States, which is the idea that in the past, people doing China studies, they don't have to justify anything. They just go to China, they collect data from China, and then it's China studies. Because it happens in China, isn't it? It's the most obvious. It's like Taiwan studies. I mean, this morning I was in Zhongyuan talking to some founders of Taiwanese studies, and I think to them, it's still the idea that if it happens in Taiwan, that's good enough to qualify as Taiwan studies, and you don't need to justify why you look at Taiwan and what is peculiar about Taiwan. The fact that it happens in Taiwan doesn't make it peculiar, right? You have McDonald's in Taiwan. Does it make McDonald's a very Taiwanese phenomenon? No, because the world has come to different parts. There are all these global phenomena and processes that have come to different parts of the world. So we can't say because this McDonald's is in Taiwan, therefore it's Taiwanese McDonald's. No, you have to say specifically, and you have to compare Taiwan with some other McDonald's in order to see what is peculiar about Taiwanese McDonald's. Maybe there isn't any Taiwanese McDonald's. Is the same everywhere. So for China studies people is a particular challenge, because for so long, if you look at China Quarterly, the articles that get published in China Quarterly, they don't need to justify the data. They don't need to justify how they define their case. As long as something happens in China, it is China studies. It's part of China studies. The assumption is that the Chineseness of the data is self-evident. It is inherent in the fact that I collect the data in China. The problem with globalization, or what globalization has created a problem for China studies or any area studies, is that we can't assume anymore, because these boundaries, these national borders, are not sealed off from each other, and what happens in China could happen in many parts of the world. So you have to demonstrate what is peculiar about data collected in China, what makes them Chinese. And to do that, what you need is comparison. Without comparing Chinese villages with non-Chinese villages, you can't convince people to say that because the village happens to be within the geographical boundary of China, that's why whatever happens there, the features there are all Chinese. No. Land grab, people study land grab in China. Land grab happens, you can find land grab in any parts of the world. So what makes Chinese land grab Chinese? How do you get at the Chineseness and therefore justify your analysis as China studies? You need comparison. You can't understand China just by looking at China. It is as simple as that. But it's easy for us to say, hey, you cannot just look at China. What does it mean is that in the past, people go to China and look at one village, one phenomenon. Now, if you take my question seriously, that means what? You can't just go to China. You have to go to China and collect the data. But at the same time, to establish Chineseness of China studies, you have to introduce some kind of comparison. And that means you have to double what you have to do. You can't just go to one place. You can't just have one case. You have to have more than one case. And at least it doubles the amount of work that is involved. It doubles the requirement of knowledge. It makes for better social science, but it also demands much more from the researcher. And that's why comparison will lead to better quality work. It usually leads to big publication, visible publication, but not many people are naturally inclined to do that kind of work because it actually is quite demanding. But I hope you take up the challenge, because in this day and age, like if 30 years ago you could avoid doing comparison, people would not really criticize you, because globalization was not, or may not have been, such a prominent factor. But these days, it's very easy. People are just aware of it. The generation that grew up under globalization, their world is global to begin with. They're native to globalization, like they're native to digital devices. And so, new questions will be asked. Anyway, so I think what we are talking about in this seminar, global and comparative ethnography, will only become more relevant and more necessary as you grow as scholars and as you age. And I think there's no way for the world to go back to a kind of sealed off national boundary. So I hope that this is a mini course. I can't really expand on a lot of things, but I hope that I've sowed the seed of an idea that get rid of this idea that ethnography is place time bound. If I succeed in this, I'll be very happy. When you go home and you think about doing ethnography, just cleanse yourself of this old-fashioned idea that doing ethnography means you're confining to a particular place and time, and that you have only one case. I've emphasized every time we meet that it is the different ways of comparison, and comparison is just absolutely critical. Not just for ethnographer, for any social science. There'll be no social science if there's no comparative thinking. You think about that. Weber wrote a lot about that. The moment you talk about social science, you're implying comparison, pure and simple, whether historical or contemporary. In this case, when we do ethnographic research, we have to make comparison explicit, because it entails choosing field sites and just come up with casing theoretical cases out of your empirical field site. So you have to consciously be thinking about comparison, because comparison directs you to different and specific locales. You have to spend time with the people there. So anyway, I'm going to spend the first part of today's time on just highlighting some of the principles that went into the making of the Specter of Global China, that research. And then the second half, I'll use some of these specific examples that you guys have brought to the table that I have some information about to do some exercises together and helping the individual student in terms of moving and strategizing and conceptualizing their cases. And you're free to bring yours as well into the discussion. But so let me jump right in to talk about the project of Global China. As I've done in the past with my past two projects, I like to say for at the beginning how I got to that project, in a sense that how did I get the idea that I would be studying it? How it refers to the question of how did the research question come about? And in my case, it just followed quite naturally from the previous two projects. For those who have attended my other seminars here, you'll realize that my first project came from theory. The second project actually emerged from the first project. And this third project actually had emerged from the second project, in the sense that when I finished my second book, Against the Law, that was about labor protest, it was around 2007. The book was published in 2007. So around 2006, I was fortunate to get a fellowship at some really fancy institute. It's called the Institute for Advanced Study, most famous for Einstein. He spent a lot of time there just doing nothing but walking around the woods and the ponds. It was really like paradise. And it was so isolated. It was in Princeton. So I got a fellowship there, and I was doing the same. I was just thinking and talking to people over lunch, and they have fabulous lunch. This cook, the chef from Switzerland, served us like organic salad and whatnot every day, and we didn't pay anything, we were there, and all you can eat kind of lunch. So at that time, around the lunch tables, my fellows scholars were talking about what they read in the newspaper, And it was around that time, 2006, that the international media carried many reports about China's investments in Africa. And it was all negative. It's 100% negative. Saying that, and we are talking about New York Times, BBC, The Guardian, Financial Times, all the major news outlets carrying stories about what the Chinese were doing, and all they were talking about most of the time was about labor exploitation. I studied labor for many years. By that time, I've written 2 books about labor, Chinese labor. So it's like, wow, what is happening there? Why were people talking about labor exploitation? Haven't we talked enough about labor exploitation, about Chinese workers in China? But then this discourse, this focus continued, and I was very surprised, and that was the puzzle for me at the beginning. Why were we talking about labor exploitation? This is, after all, a capitalist society. Haven't people been used to a labor exploitation? You know, why? What is so puzzling about labor exploitation? And why were they reporting on it? And then so I was like, something is really wrong, either with the discourse itself or something really hellish is happening in Africa that would trigger that kind of interest, intense international interest on this age-old problem. No, Karl Marx had talked about labor exploitation. That was what? England, Manchester, mid-19th century. And I was 20, it was 2006. Why are we still talking about that? And about China, I mean, the workshop of the world, of course it was based on exploitation. So that triggered my interest, and it was puzzling because of the widespread attention on this problem. So, and why Global China? There was another reason why Global China caught my attention. I told you I was studying Chinese development through the lens of labor, and even up to my second book, I was still looking at domestic development of China. China has gone global as a major source of outbound foreign investment, FDI. If you look at FDI as a phenomenon, the US was and is still the leading exporter of foreign investment. But China, even in 2006, was rapidly catching up. It's still trailing behind many of the traditional Atlantic powers, but still, it's kind of making a very quick, rapid surge in terms of ranking. So, and Global China is a challenge to me theoretically, because that's when I started to think about, well, China is no longer confined within the national boundary of China. And it will be a challenge for sociologists and for ethnographers in particular, how to tackle this thing called Global China, because when China was still inside China, the boundaries of what you study is pretty clearly defined. But now it has like the gin is getting out of the bottle, and it becomes something so amorphous. It takes so many forms. How are we going to study that? But it's real because you feel the impact. People are talking about it. It's not in our mind that Global China is there. It just becomes very diffused and takes many forms as a kind of power, as a kind of force. So it's kind of curious to me, and it's also a challenge, and I don't like to repeat myself, from book to book. So I was looking for something that helped me to track China, but at the same time presented me as an intellectual and methodological kind of challenge. And so I was very, once I got started, I got very obsessed with this. That's why I didn't let it go. Even I didn't get anywhere for the first 3 years before I met the vice president, before my friend became a vice president. So I think it was the intellectual and methodological unknown that really drew me to that project. So my advice to you is, when there's something that's challenging, don't get away from it. I mean, it may be something that really can keep you going for a long time. And maybe that is really something that is new and requires some original research effort. And it is something that you can really put yourself on the map by doing, because it needs somebody to do it. So what is puzzling? The puzzling thing is, of course, at that stage, it was the widespread report on something that it should be normalized, that it is just part of what capitalism is, and why we're talking about China. So at first, it was the discourse about China, that China is singled out among all the investors. Exploitation happens to all investors. US go to invest in China, of course it's exploitation. US or Japan goes to invest in Southeast Asia, it's exploitation. Why are we not talking about all these sources of FDI? Why do people focus? And when they've reported on those, there's always this sense of colonialism, there's always this suggestion, implicit or explicit, that it is somehow different. When China invests, it's a different kind of investment that we all should be worried or weary about, because sometimes they made it explicit, because it is state investment, because the government is behind these investments, as if China is not playing by the rule, as if it is not a level playing field, because this kind of investment comes with the blessing of the state and the resources of the state, the subsidies. You hear a lot, subsidies, Chinese government subsidies. So actually that was the reports. Of course, later on, at the end of my research, I found them to be quite unfounded, because these guys, they went to Africa, these journalists, they went to Africa, guess what? They never do comparison, right? They just find out, look to Chinese companies and say, hey, look, they exploit workers. Well, yes, Chinese companies exploit workers. What about next door, the Indian companies? Don't they exploit workers? Because they don't look, they don't compare. They just say, oh, I want to see China in Africa, and write about it. And they target the Chinese. And of course, they find exploitation in Chinese companies. But does that make that Chinese, or is it because it's capitalist company that leads to exploitation? So the lack of comparison, of course, make those journalistic reports flawed, but it was by reading newspapers that I got sensitized to something that may be happening that is interesting. And so it's puzzling that China has been singled out, and the idea that somehow Chinese investment is different. I got this idea from these international reports. And it turned out to be something I study, and it became my research question. What is peculiar about Chinese investment? But at the beginning, it was just a lot of reports about it, and a lack of comparison that led to some erroneous perspectives. But however flawed they are, they became the source of my inspiration. So when you were looking for your topic, you get it from talking to your friends, you get it from doing some pilot research in the field, but also when we do what everybody does these days, you read news and think about the news, what the stories in the news suggest to you, and try to frame those as research questions. You can, they're not always correct, but the inspiration could come from anywhere. So what is puzzling? So the question is, what is specific about Chinese investment that creates so much controversy, and the idea that somehow if investment is backed up by the state, it makes it different. That's the assumption in the reports. But I turn it into an empirical question. Is it different? How is it different? So the whole project that you heard 2 days ago was the 3 dimensions along which Chinese state capital, state investment, is different from the regular global private capital. I was going to tell you something, I forgot what. Anyway, so theoretical sampling. Well, if global China or foreign outbound Chinese investment is my subject matter, then like you have to decide on where to go, what will be the case, right? You have to find a case, a theoretically important case to do the study, or sites to do the studies. At that point, I had the idea of doing Africa. I mean, I could have gone to Latin America, and today it would be, along the Belt and Road, it would be the Middle East. But 2006, Africa was the new frontier of Chinese investment. It was in the news, and to me, it was intriguing because I knew nothing about that place, that continent. I feel ashamed as a sociologist that I knew nothing. I've never been to the continent except in Egypt. So I felt, okay, well, I want to do China in Africa, but then Africa has 55 countries, or 54, sorry, 54 countries. So how are you going? Which one then do you choose to study? You have to do some theoretical sampling, and very soon, after a year or two, after several initial trips, I decided it should be Zambia. Now, my claim, as I've told you, we can't claim statistical representativeness. That is, I can't claim Zambia is representative of Africa because of the characteristic of Zambia representing the population of African countries. I have to justify Zambia by saying what Zambia is significant theoretically. So I was looking for theoretical significant case. And I chose Zambia for several reasons. One, Zambia at that time, and still is, by and large, China's most important site of investment in Africa in terms of commodities, that is raw material investment, extractive industry. Zambia, there's the mine that I study, the state-owned mine in Zambia I study, was the first ever in Chinese history, a mine in foreign country acquired by a Chinese state-owned company. It was the very, very first, historical first. And Zambia was Africa's leading copper producer. So if we care about China's investment in the extractive industry, this was the most important case because Zambia was the most important exporter of copper. And this mine was the first ever state-acquired mine by the Chinese, anywhere in the world, not just in Africa. And Zambia also happened to be the site where the Chinese, 2006, they announced that it would be the site of its first special economic zone, first Chinese-owned special economic zone. That means China looked at Zambia quite differently. And also, historically, Zambia, in the day of Mao, when China was cut off from most international relations, when the world didn't recognize Beijing, they recognized Taipei, by the way, until 1971. When the world didn't recognize Beijing, guess which two countries in Africa recognized Mao's regime? One of them was Zambia. Kaunda was a household name. Kaunda was the long-time Zambian president. I have friends of my age, and he said when I told them that I study Zambia, the first name that came to mind was Kaunda. And I said, why are you so familiar with this African leader I didn't even heard of before I started the study? They said, in the news, throughout the Mao era, he and this guy from Tanzania, Nyerere, were the two only foreign leaders who would be covered in Chinese official news because that was the only two African leaders who would shake hand with Mao. So Zambia was important to me because it offered the case where I can argue China has the best political relationship with for the longest time, and therefore the friendliest condition for Chinese investment is what sociologists would call an extreme case. That is, it is an extremely favorable case for Chinese investment. And what you find there, because it is the best scenario, you can then extend the argument. If this is the best case for Chinese investment, and if they fail, that means it's more likely for so-and-so, for it to fail in other countries. So you can turn this one case and establish its critical status in some respect, and therefore make implicit deduction about the significance of your finding. And for some very also practical reasons, Zambia, I chose Zambia, I mentioned it to you before, because my own advisor, before he became a sociologist, before he went to grad school, he spent 3 years in Zambia. He wrote this classic monograph on the copper belt, which turned out to be also the site of my study. And because he wrote in the 1960s, late 1960s, the book came out in 1972, but the condition that he documented was in the late 1960s, just several years after Zambian independence. It was exactly almost 40 years between his monograph and my fieldwork. So I could use his monograph, his research, his finding on almost exactly the same copper belt. And I finally traced some of the places he stayed was also where I stayed for a little bit during my field work. It was the same mines. Mines don't change. Huh? Mines were there. It's just different people come to exploit the resource. The mines locations were always there. So that provided me with a very good historical benchmark to establish another point of comparison. So I used this monograph as much as possible to establish both the macro condition and the condition in the mines and the labor politics in the mines. And so for all these reasons, had it only been one of them, I would not be so sure that I would be studying Zambia. But Zambia just happened to combine all these good features that I could leverage and establish the significance of my case and the kind of comparative material that I could use to understand the current situation and track the 40 years, the gap of 40 years and how capitalism itself has changed between the 40 years between our two studies, and try to say, okay, well, it was capitalism, but 40 years ago, before neoliberal capitalism, you only have two colonial kind of related country power, the companies there. They were owned by one British, one South African company. So the capital there was very colonial, they came from colonial countries. But when I arrived in Zambia, China was just among many countries. So neoliberalism actually opened up, internationalized the copper belt, the same area. But now you have a whole range of foreign investors, and not just two. That makes a big, big difference. When you only have two investors versus now today you have 10. For the government, you could play. You didn't feel the same degree of dependence as the state was back in the days right after independence in the 60s, when only there were two companies who actually were investing in each other. So basically you have one investor. Now you have China, you have India, you have South Africa, you have Canadians, you have Swiss, Brazilians. So neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism has changed the landscape, and that had impact on what the state could do with foreign capital. And how could I establish that? Well, because there was this monograph that was written 40 years ago. And of course, it happened to me by advisor. I could ask him things that wasn't in the monograph. But it was not because people always say, because she's a Brewer student, that's why she studies Zambia. I wish that was so simple. I wish I could only justify, and I could justify I study Zambia because my advisor studies Zambia. Nobody would have appreciated it, nobody would have approved it. But it was really because it just happened. You can say, I got lucky. Well, China happens to be big in Zambia too. Of all the countries China could have invested in, somehow it was the same country where my advisor did his work and published this classic work. Anyway, so that's why I chose Zambia. And again, when you're dealing with the topic, if you were me, you also have to find a country or choose a country to study. You need to provide justification from the very beginning. Otherwise, it will be very hard for you once you invest in doing fieldwork in that country, and actually you don't have any good reason for studying that country, and you'll be asked to justify the choice of case. So rather than, just randomly choose one or choose one because of convenience, if you have the opportunity, everything being equal, you want to choose one that have some intellectual rationale to it, and that really helps you to amplify the theoretical significance of this one particular case. Okay, well, so as I chose Zambia, but then why did I pick copper and construction? I sort of alluded to this during the talk. Copper and construction are two major sectors. These were the two leading sectors of Chinese investment in Africa. So if I'm studying global China, I have to choose these two sectors because they were the two major sectors absorbing the most investments from China. But also, I saw the theoretical significance of having these two because they involve very different balance of class power. Copper is where labor is most organized and has the most collective capacity. Construction is the other end on the spectrum of class power. That is, workers are the most informalized and the least organized. That is, they are the weakest in terms of bargaining with capital. So, and also, copper is place-bound. As I said, the mines don't move. You go to the mines, you can't take the mines elsewhere. Construction is footloose. It is the opposite of copper mines. It's footloose in the sense that you finish a project, you move along. You finish, you don't stay there. If you're a construction company, there's nothing for you to earn, to make profit of if you stay there. Projects take you from place to place, and as a result, labor is moving. You go to that place, you recruit informal labor from that place. And so workers do not have the communal power that miners usually can accumulate over time. And so the labor process also is very unskilled work mostly, whereas mining depends on unionized skilled labor. So the labor capital relation in these two industries are different enough that they allow me to say, even with Chinese capital, maybe it differs across these two, depending on workers' power, workers' capacity. So that's why the comparison here in this book is a double comparison. It's a 2x2. That is between Chinese state capital and global private capital, the two types of capital. And for each case, each type, two industries. So you can envision a 2x2 kind of table, copper and construction, and two types of capital. And for every step along the way, I was very conscious of justifying why I chose these as cases and what they represented, theoretical casing. So I think I just can't emphasize more because what you do from day to day depends on what you choose to study. So establishing cases that are really pertinent and central to your theoretical questions is very important, is fundamental. If you got it wrong, I'm not saying that you would not get your degree, but I think but you will be wasting your time, and your effort may be wasted. You'll be doing equally hard work, but the results may not be as spectacular or as fruitful, as productive as it could be. So be careful when you choose your cases, whether it's a place, whether it's an industry, whether it's a time period. Comparison doesn't have to be cross-national. You can compare Hong Kong before, after the handover. You can compare Taiwan before democratization. You can compare Taiwan in the Japanese colonial period and post-colonial period. So we can do a lot with one country. It doesn't have to involve cross-national comparison. But comparison, I think, is very, very pivotal and absolutely essential if you want to explain things. Because without comparison, it is very hard to see what is causing what, because you can't really isolate, hold something constant. You can't really see how things mix together to form a causal logic that lead to an outcome, another set of things that form causal logic that lead to another outcome. So whether we're talking about variable comparison or encompassing comparison, you want the cases to be comparable as well as theoretically meaningful. Okay, a case of what? I have suggested that in this study, I was interested in seeing these companies. Now, empirically, I was studying some mines, a couple of mines, construction projects, construction companies. But they to me, represent types of capital. So the case, these are companies, but to me, these are empirical companies that represent types of capital. The cases are two cases of capital, two types of capital. So empirical case is different from the theoretical case. That we have discussed, I hope you understand. If not, you stop me and let me know. So the theoretical project, in the talk I didn't have time to get into, but the overall framing of the project was to say that the literature on varieties of capitalism, which is a big literature that people use to explain variations in capital in different national settings. So British firms would behave differently from German firms because British political economy is different from the German political economy in how the state, how the union, how technology relate to each other, and so on and so forth. So there is a big literature that tries to explain different manifestations of capitalism in different national contexts, and it's called Varieties of Capitalism theory. At first, I looked at this set of literature because it's most relevant to my question of how Chinese capital, how Chinese investment is different from other investments. And then I decided at the end of the study that literature is not very useful. It has many flawed conceptions and assumptions. And so I shifted. The book basically argues that we need to shift from this study of varieties of capitalism to varieties of capital. My argument is that global capitalism is one system. There's only one type of capitalism as a system. But within that system, there are different types of capital with different kinds of interests defined by either shareholders or private owner of that capital, which is in the case of global private capital, or by state, nation state. In the case of China, it is defined by Beijing. Interest defined by Beijing that includes interest accumulation and optimization, but a whole host of other things. And so I think it's productive to think in terms of varieties of capital, in terms of who define what interest that capital has to realize. And from there, flow the different ways of dealing with labor, the different styles, and also the way of management. Anyway, so that's the basic outline of the study that covers the grounds that we have been talking about using this method, ethnographic method, and comparison. The several decisions that we have to make. The research question, the puzzle, choosing your cases, try to do theoretical sampling, and then case your case. That is, case as a verb. You have to constitute the case out of your empirical case. The empirical cases for me are the corporations. What they represent, the theoretical case. You need to think through abstraction and theory and concept in order to constitute empirical cases as theoretical cases. And that activity we call casing. So this is something you need to do in the process. And then theoretical reformulation is another step in the process. Of course, you do field work all along, but these are the things that should go through your head, in your mind. The kind of analytical strategies that you have to deal with, whatever research you do using ethnography. So these are just the steps and the components of that go into a ethnographic study. Any question so far before I move on? Does it make sense? Because we've been talking about this for several years. Speak up.
Is there another type of capital besides private-owned capital and state capital?
What are you thinking? Yeah, what are you thinking of? Good, yeah, what are you thinking?
No idea.
Anyone who... Have you heard of, because I've been to quite a few presentations talking about my book, so this is not the first time. Some question like this have arisen, and at the beginning I didn't know, but then I thought maybe there is another kind. Have you heard of social enterprises? So those are enterprises. Those are, it's a kind of investment, right? Somebody made an investment, but the goals are not defined by nation state. The goals are not defined by private capital owners or shareholders. Who define the goals? The interest. And you can see the interests are different from profit maximization. So it's a kind of maybe socialized capital. People call it solidarity economy, but they don't usually think or frame the phenomenon in terms of type of capital. But you can do it, right? I mean, you can study what does that capital, who has the say to decide what interest this kind of capital should realize, and what else besides money. I mean, they need to stay afloat. It's like the mines that I talked about, the Chinese mine. They can't go into the red and expect handout from the state. So they have to make some profit, but not maximum profit. The same with social enterprises. They can't, be losing money all the time and expect something. So some kind of profit generation, but not maximum profit. But then its interest incorporates also some other causes. And who define that? And how does that shape its labor relation? I mean, it's a great topic, I think. What kind of labor relation? I mean, a lot of people who they would hire disabled workers, people who are physically challenged in one way or another. But does it mean that it is a more gentle kind of companies, or the bosses are less exploitative? I mean, it's it's very interesting. And maybe there are other types of capital too, but that's just one example that people usually can think of when they raise similar kind of question.
One is relevant to comparison. To capture the, for example, the Chineseness of a case in China, you say that we need to do cross-nation comparison. But later on, you say that is not necessary. So when someone is doing a research on a single country, and the comparative element would be like the time dimension, how would that be possible to define or to capture the somethingness?
If you have variations within one country, let's say you have variations between the north and the south of China, okay? It's China, and people there are still Chinese. And if you find internal variation among Chinese regions, across Chinese regions, or among Chinese people, that means there is not the Chineseness is not one thing. The Chineseness could encompass multiple ways of doing things. So at least you would not have this idea that, China is like this, or Chineseness is something essential to what you observe. The variation itself is an important point, that there is heterogeneous features. China is not just one piece. And what Chineseness, the variety of Chineseness would depend on, for instance, the regional political economy, the historical context, and so on and so forth. So you get yourself away from this idea of essential Chineseness in China because it's in China, therefore it's the same. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. Okay, so basically that's about the book and about the kind of analytical steps that the key analytical steps, decisions that I have to make. I'd like to say a little bit about this ethnography as opposed to the other two that we discussed in previous seminars. This is a global ethnography, and I want to say a few words about the essential characteristics, some very important features of this kind of ethnography, if you call it global ethnography. Well, what is a global ethnography? It will be, I would say, I mean, you can define it in many, many different ways, but at least one good definition, that the one that is in the reading that I assigned. The reading is very dense, so if you don't feel like you've understood everything is there that he said, fine, go back later on, just to know that there is some piece that explain what global ethnography is. It's studying ethnography that studies globalization, and it means that you don't see globalization as something abstract, that work behind your back somehow is inevitable, it is overwhelming, it is agentless. It happens as a force that nobody can stop, it is objective, it is there. Because anyone trying to use ethnography to study this process will see it is anything but the above descriptions. Studying globalization with ethnography means that you see globalization as grounded and constituted, resisted, and negotiated by social actors. So it will lead you to a very different perception of globalization as a global process, as a global phenomenon. There's a very famous guy writing for the New York Times in the US by the name of Thomas Friedman. Have you heard of him?
Yeah.
Oh, why? About what? What is he most famous for?
The planet is flat.
The world is flat, yes. His best-selling blockbuster book talking about globalization. The world is flat, meaning nobody can stop it. It goes everywhere. There is no hurdle to the process of globalization. Everybody will be swept up in it. There's no barrier for this global process to go through, to move through the world and sort of absorb the whole world in this, suck the whole world in. It basically describes, he wants to describe the market. Basically, globalization is the spread of the market everywhere, to every arena of life. And because it's a market force, people like him thinks that it is unstoppable. You can take advantage of it, you can be pushed aside by it, but it will be there. It is there, and you better make best use of it, otherwise you will fall behind. It's also, the world is flat because he would say the old technology, Once you have technology, it will go around the world and makes the world connected. So making the world accessible to everybody, equalizing people's culture, homogenizing culture, and so on and so forth, all these imageries. So the world is flat. And that is the kind of image of globalization that global ethnography will be against. That is, whatever the topic you study, if you study globalization using ethnography, you will come away, or you will produce an account of globalization in a very different light. And you will see globalization not as inevitable and agentless force, but as everywhere contested, negotiated, shaped, and acted by some people, because that's what ethnographers do. We bring these abstract processes to the ground and specify who is doing what and with what result, and so on and so forth. So, there are three ways or three dimensions of globalization, three types of topics for people who want to study globalization ethnographically in this article that I assigned. The first is global forces. Now, how do you study globalization? How do you study global forces? Basically, we'll be studying the global, what we meant by that term, global forces. Usually, we mean the global economy, the global state system, transnational state system, the global culture. And the way we studied these things was to see them as constituted through certain mediators, felt through mediators. There are people who were the brokers, who were the agents who promote or who carry out the job of globalizing economy. And as ethnographers, we focus on them. So for instance, what would be a good example? The managers I studied in the mines or in Africa, the Chinese managers, the Indian managers who were sent by the companies, they were the mediators, they were the realizers, they were the people who realized the interests of global capital. So global capital you can imagine conceptualized as an abstract force, but ethnographically, if you want to study that abstract force, where will you look? You will look for the mediators, the agents that would be tasked with realizing the forces on the ground. Forces here means economic interest, political power that goes around the world, that transcend national borders. Cultural create, like, some, I don't know, pop stars who would move around stage, perform around the world and promote, carry with them in the performance a global musical genre, spread that genre around the world, or certain kind of messages. So you want to focus on these mediators, and what you will also see in your ethnography, to do the ethnography of global capital, for instance. Like me, I would follow those managers because they were foot soldiers of the abstract capital that goes around the world that needs to realize profits in particular location. While I do that, I would also, because I'm grounded, I was staying with them, I shadow them, I live with them, what I would see would be necessarily people's reaction on the ground to these agents of capital. So that what you will end up seeing or illustrating, demonstrating, will be a process of global capital flow with the foot soldiers trying to realize the interest of the origin of capital, but also how local people react to that capital. It will not be an abstract flow of capital, as people would say. The globalization that you will end up analyzing will be very different from people who would just look at statistics and not do ethnography. If you do ethnography, you will be targeting real social actors who are realizing these global forces or mediating these global forces, whether we're talking about culture, politics, or economy. So that's one way to capture the global. Another way is to find connections across sites. Multiple sites. You connect disparate sites around the world because they form a global process. So for instance, global commodity chain, I don't know whether people have heard of it, global value chain, commodity chain. So things, okay, so this guy. This is the embodiment of global commodity chain, because It was designed in California, US, with components from around the world and labor in China, right? So, by following the making of the iPhone, you will be, if you are the ethnographer of the making of the iPhone, you will be going to all these different sites of creation, of design, of production, of sales, marketing. You connect them together, and that would be a global commodity chain that make this possible. So that's another way of doing global ethnography, is to connect the sites and see the whole, the global phenomenon at the level of the end of the totality when you connect all these sites. So it could be flows of people, goods, information, identities across multiple sites. So looking at global connections. The third, equally important but less studied, would be global imaginations. Global in the sense of global ideologies, global claims, global ideas that float around the world and make the world a global community. And this usually is very useful when we study movement, because many movements these days, they become global movements not just by connecting with like movements in other countries, which happened, but also there's this ideology that has gone through around the world. Now these days, human rights is one of the very recognizable global imagination. And it has been used very powerfully by people decades ago would not have been using. For instance, I have a colleague at Michigan, where I taught before UCLA. He is a Japanese American, but he was Japanese actually. He was studying some very small indigenous people in different parts of the world. Indigenous people in Japan, indigenous people here, in the Philippines, and just, you name it. There are many of them, by the way. And what he was so interesting, the finding was, he studied indigenous people's movement before and after a certain period. And the most interesting distinction was, before, decades ago, these indigenous movements didn't use the term human rights. With globalization, human rights become the way they empower themselves, because when they use this ideology to their movement, making claims on the basis of a global imagination, what they did was to successfully raise the platform of action from nation state to the international courts or international civil society and whatever. And all these human rights convention and so international organizations would have to hear their case. And these transnational power holder entities would then act on the nation state and then give them the right. So whereas before they were just arguing based on cultural authenticity, autonomy, and making claims to the nation state, with this global ideology, which is another aspect of globalization, it was not, they started with this claim and then translate that into real action. So it's not just imagination. It is cultural ideology and claim that have real political, behavioral, institutional power impact. So you could study globalization in terms of global ideology and how movements or other people use it, abuse it, or doing many things with it. So in that sense, even ideology is not just ideology, is not just something in the abstract. Ideology needs people to diffuse the ideology, requires people to concretize ideology into real action and therefore real impact in the world. So there are people you can study. So I have students in the US, at UCLA, who study, in many countries, post-conflict society, they have transitional justice. They have these tribunals, truth and reconciliation. She studies truth and reconciliation tribunals as a new transnational institutional type in many different places. And the way she studied them was she spent a lot of time going to the conferences where people who were professionals to do arbitration would meet and talk and discuss among themselves what are the norms, how should we do this kind. And what she was trying to do was these are professionals who actually realized this ideology of transitional justice. They were formed in, don't think it is global, so where do I see this global thing? Well, it's like untouchable, it's where is global, is global? Well, actually, you can actually see them in action. These are the people who have to deliberate, who have to argue, and who would disagree, and they meet. They are not just in virtual reality, they talk through emails, yeah, maybe, but they also, like us, we have annual meetings for sociologists and anthropologists, and she goes a lot too. The field site for her would be really global, goes everywhere, different places, different countries, but these are where, the mediator, the foot soldiers of global ideologies would meet. And so even global imaginations, you can do ethnographic work because they're not as ungrounded as they seem. So these are the three possibilities. Can I have some air conditioning? It's very hot for me. Any questions so far? The three types, the three levels of realities that together make up globalization and which we can do ethnographic work on? If not, then I think I like to. Now I feel it. Yes.
I think there's an example that more there's an example of global imagination that more people study on is the idea of free market.
Yes, good example. And how do they study it?
But I'm not sure that they frame it as a global imagination. But for example, before and after 1997, some country South Korea was being imposed to reform and restructure its national economy, but all those examples in Africa.
Yeah, structural adjustment.
Yeah.
Policies, yes.
Yeah.
But then still, studying the policy is the result of global ideology, this market, ideology.
Yeah.
But I think it's the result. But if you want to see the spread, let's say somebody mentioned to me your project is about diffusion. I forgot what. Diffusion of what, I can't remember. But somebody has a topic, a research idea about diffusion. So let's say diffusion of market ideology. Well, how do you study the diffusion of an ideology? The example you raised was about the result of, the policy result of market liberalism. How do you study an ideology? This is being diffused around the world. Who will be the people that you would want to follow?
Economists.
Economists. Why economists?
Because all those papers or policy documents are written by
That's right. They're written by economists. These are the bad guys, huh? They usually, economists write for economists in academic writing. But usually you want to focus on a particular group of economists who are the policy advisors. The government would send officials to attend World Bank. World Bank actually is a big university. It is not just making loans to countries. They run numerous conferences and training workshops. Mm-hmm. So one of my colleagues, a friend of mine, University of Minnesota, he wrote a book called, I forgot the name, but it's about the World Bank as not just having financial power, but also having creating knowledge, symbolic power, to shape your worldview. Government's worldview saying that, hey, the only way you can get out of your underdevelopment is to open up the market. This has to be spread. This has to be taught to ministers of economic and also of the economy, and also its directors and what all the civil servants, they got trained by the World Bank. So it's discursive power that the World Bank is propagating, creating. So there, you actually can study the process. This, my friend, Goldman, Michael Goldman, he actually went to many of these training. I mentioned, go to make training workshop, you see a lot of things. And this is how neoliberalism, as a kind of free-floating ideology, can be studied ethnographically. You see how people actually formalize, codify neoliberalism into concrete policy, and then they teach these things to civil servants and economists working for governments in the third world. And their textbooks. I know this reality while doing field work in Africa. People are so poor in Africa. The workshop materials that they get, like NGOs, I went with some NGO and labor unionists, and I saw in their offices, they have like the readers that they got from attending World Bank or some kind of ILO, International Labour Organization workshops. Usually I don't keep them. These are materials for me, but they study them. I actually saw them in the office, and I said, why will you study these things? They said, we don't have other material. Why don't they have more other material? Because they're too poor to buy books. So the World Bank, by providing training and the textbooks, it's an educational institution, creating knowledge, and once you think this is knowledge, scientific knowledge, you practice it. You put it into your policy-making process. This is how you can concretize, ethnographically study something that appears to be agentless, abstract, global, is there, but you don't know how to empirically ground it. And once you see that, once you focus on these people, you can see also how they subvert the knowledge, how they talk back to what they have been taught. They don't necessarily have to embrace whatever is taught. They could debate. You can follow these guys and see how they use or not use. Selectively use what part they select, what part they abandon. So that you know that neoliberalism, yes, it's an ideology that has been propagated by powerful agency like the World Bank, but which part of it is being propagated and appropriated? Which part is being used in other ways than what the World Bank intends? So it's very interesting. It's not like it is fixed, set in stone, always powerful. People have agency to subvert it. And how can you see that? You won't see that if you just look at statistics. You won't see that if you just look at World Bank documents. You have to do ethnography in order to reveal all the possibilities. All the possibilities, the alternatives in people's reaction. If you don't document that, the world will not know that there are alternatives. I think that's the importance of doing ethnography, not just because you produce another kind of knowledge, but also in practice, you're suggesting possibilities that may not last long enough to become statistics, to become institutions. People resist the status quo, always carry weight to crush it, and then it removes it, it makes them disappear. If you don't document, if we ethnographers don't document that reality, the knowledge that we create would not recognize those alternatives. And people will think that, well, no documentation of objective alternatives, then this is the only way. So in a way, doing ethnography is very political, because by documenting something that would be disappeared or made to go away because these are powerless people trying to do something, and these things would never end up in statistics, because statistics only capture phenomena that are either quantifiable or could last so that somebody could go and count them. But many of the resistance behavior that we would encounter in the field, they can't last that long because of the power structure. They get crushed and get deleted from reality. And so I think ethnography is inherently inherently progressive and really illuminating because I think this is the only way I can think of, only method that allows you to capture something that is usually hidden or unseen because of the existing power structure that we are a part of. It's like we are very seldom able to study up to the elite. We study down because the elite can say no to us, and so we don't know that much about them, as much we know about the powerless people. Anyway, so, what time? Okay, let me go very quickly through these, and then we'll take a break and then go to your projects. Okay, event. Now, so I've talked about global ethnography, event, and eventful comparison. Now, event, in this book, I make a big use of one particular event, and that was the 2008 financial crisis. It hit Zambia while I was doing field work, and I use it as an opportunity for comparison. That is, something really significant, earth-shaking is happening to the field site. Not every happening is an event, by the way. Event is not my invention. Event is a particular type of happening. And a few people have written about the idea of event, but I draw on a sociologist, a historian at Chicago, William Sewell, to say that event, just third line, event is a rare subclass of happenings that instead of being the product of structure, has the potential to change structure. Usually to sociologists and social scientists, they privilege structure. Structure produces behavior. Structure guides our behavior. So if you want to explain certain thing, you look at the structure and see, the likelihood of something being produced. Class structure. Your class structure, you're the working class, then, there is a likelihood that you go to a certain kind of school, you vote in a particular way. Structure shapes behavior. Structure shapes outcome. If it is an authoritarian system, the political opportunity structure is less for resistance, so on and so forth. So we care about structure a lot because we assume causal weight goes to structure. Event is a very rare class of happening that has the potential to change structure, it is so important. And it breaks up the status quo so much. It is such a challenge to the status quo. It shakes things up so much that structural impact may be eliminated, reduced, or at least redirected. It disrupts structure. So it has to be, it can't be everything that happens, you call it an event, and that's not an event. That doesn't make events very meaningful. Event has to be of this particular significance. It doesn't have to be a big event in terms of number of people or whatnot, but it has to be undermining or disruptive of structure. The financial crisis, 2008, how old are you guys? 10? Do you remember it? Yeah? I encourage you to watch some of the documentaries that were made, because in the moment people were just panicking. We didn't know because there was so many things were made, decisions were made behind the scenes, and the numbers, the financial sector were so far from us, and we didn't even know what they were doing with all the derivatives and all those new financial instruments that they traded, and then the mortgage crisis. But read some of the watch some of the documentaries that have come out since. What you'll see is that we were really at the brink of collapse, the whole world as we know it. It was people at the very, very top, from the government and Wall Street. They were truly panicking and were talking to each other that tomorrow there'll be no more capitalism, I mean, they were talking at that level of severity. I'm not kidding. I'm not inventing these discourses. This is in the documentaries. That's why I wanted to watch it. And so that is an event in the sense that capitalism, if we always try to explain things by reference to capitalism, that was the moment when that structure was about to collapse or be transformed in disastrous way. So that was an event in the field. For me, it was an occasion where a lot of things became uncertain, and I think the reaction of the government in Zambia and the reaction of the two types of capital become very important, and you can really see when everybody was firing people. Chinese state capital said, we're not firing people. Actually, they bought another mine. It is where the logic of these two types of capital, when the structure is wide open because of this event, broken open, the logics were up in the air, crisis moments when the normal rules, when the normal powers were temporarily suspended, that those are the times when, if you happen to see in the course of your fieldwork something like that, make great use of it, because it's more revelatory than when nothing happens. So don't panic if something. I remember, I didn't talk about this. I remember I panicked for my first book project when I was but kicked out from my Shenzhen plant, and it turned out that, looking back, that was a moment when management was panicking because there was some brewing of labor unrest, and they want me to be out because they wanted to just sort of get rid of all the possible reasons for the unrest. And you can see that, workers were beginning to be dissatisfied with the regime. And so I didn't have to be as panicked as I was. I could turn this moment, my own event in my little world, I got fired, into an occasion where I could talk to workers and management afterwards to reconstruct that moment and see what was the real reason for them to kick me out. So I think you can make use of all kinds of happenings in the field, but event is a particularly good opportunity for knowledge. So just don't feel too worried about it. We usually think of the negative things connected with crisis, but crisis could also be a golden opportunity. Eventful comparison is the use of event and as a crisis moment. I also in the book talk about China in Africa actually itself is an event of capitalism. I think maybe this is too complicated. I'm not sure this is too relevant. But if you want to understand what I mean by China in Africa is an event in capitalism, you can read the book, the last part of it. But basically, it suggests the idea that capitalism has two phases, two dimensions. One is the repetitive dimension. That is, there's a system logic to it. So boom and bust. Boom and bust is repetitive. You see boom, and then we'll bust, and then boom again, bust, destructive. What is it? Schumpeter's what? Destructive what?
Creative destruction.
Creative destruction, yes. So the economy grow, and at some point, it has to come down. Overcapacity, people will get less profits, and some less competitive firms will be crushed, and the economy will have to adjust, so there'll be a bust. And then when things got very cheap again, people will reinvest, and it will become a boom again. So this kind of cycle, ups and down, the cycle. So capitalism is very abstract. There's an abstract logic, dynamic to this repetitive cycle. So it's very boring because it repeats itself. You grow and then you shrink and you grow again. But Sewell was saying that this is only one aspect of capitalism as a system. Capitalism is also very eventful. That is, there are all kinds of interesting, unexpected happenings that would happen within this repetitive cycle. So for instance, China itself becoming this boom country, this boom economy, is unexpected. It is an event in the cycle of capitalism. The invention of internet is another event that is not repetitive, that nobody really predict, but make a big impact on the system. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the Great Depression, 1929, it was not just a regular bust cycle. It's really traumatizing. It was widespread. It affected the whole world. World War, again, is events that is outside of this capitalist system that breaks its repetitive cycle. So you have a system with two very different quality. One is repetitive abstract. The other is very concrete, eventful. It has event will change it. So what he wants to suggest is to think of capitalism both in these two logics. And to me, I think China in Africa is an event in the sense of the Great Depression, in the sense of the Great World War, in the sense of the invention of internet. It is part of capitalism, but it has the capacity to transform or break open some of its structural paths and create something new. It's a big moment of uncertainty. It could lead to as my study shows, it could lead to Zambia getting an opportunity to develop, or it can be predatory. It could make Zambia go back to indebtedness again. So I think events for me has a big part in this book, both in the sense of I use the event of the crisis as a moment of comparison, but also as a theoretical category to think about what China in Africa is at that level, as a system level. It is an event where things could happen either way. And so I think China in Africa is an empirical subject, but then you can also find ways to theorize it in the larger system. So China in Africa is a global phenomenon, but it doesn't mean that there's no external to this phenomenon. The external is the nature of capitalism and its characteristics, and China in Africa is part of that. And that's why I want to introduce this idea of event. And you may want to read more. You can search philosophers that talk about event and event analysis. What is it called? You have the quantitative event analysis or something. Event history, yes, event history, which I don't know what it is, but